a manila envelope slid across a metal exam table. A thin hand did not pick it up. A sheepdog on the table lifted his head and pressed his nose against the envelope. The vet set both his hands flat on the metal. The sheepdog laid his head on the envelope and closed his eyes. The thin hand finally picked the envelope up. The sheepdog did not lift his head. The envelope was heavy. The flap was sealed with the dull brown of old wax. The thin hand turned the envelope over. On the back, in a careful small print, were 4 words. The words were the name of a man dead 9 years. The thin hand stopped. The sheepdog lifted his head and pressed his nose against the back of the thin wrist. The vet did not speak. Whose envelope was this for her? Stay with me on this one. Her name was Iris Pemberton. She was 78 years old, and she had been a widow for 9 years, and she had brought her old border collie sheepdog Murphy in for his regular 6-month checkup at Dr. Halloran's small 1-story veterinary office on the edge of the small Pennsylvania town, where she had lived for 53 of her years. Murphy was 11 years old. He had been her late husband Edgar's sheepdog, brought home in a small wooden crate from a sheep farm down the river the spring of Murphy's 8th week of life, 2 years before Edgar had died of a stroke at the breakfast table on a January morning with the radio on. Edgar had not had a chance to say goodbye. He had set down his coffee cup and looked across the table at her and put his hand to his chest and then slid sideways out of the chair. And by the time the paramedics had arrived 20 minutes later, he had been gone for 15 of those minutes. Iris had not been ready. No one ever is. She had buried Edgar in the small cemetery beside the white church up the road. She had carried the small wooden urn home in her thin hands and set it on the kitchen mantel above the wood stove. She had folded Edgar's reading chair afghan and laid it across the back of the chair, the way she had laid it across his shoulders every winter evening for 46 years. She had let Murphy sleep across the foot of her bed every night since. Murphy was a small dog, 65 pounds, with a black and white coat and a long, careful tail, and a pair of brown eyes that watched her the way Edgar had once watched her across a kitchen table. Murphy had been Edgar's first true companion in his 3-year retirement from the small accounting firm, where Edgar had worked for 38 years. Edgar had been a small, quiet man with small, careful glasses and a small, careful pencil mustache, and the kind of quiet brown eyes Murphy had inherited from him at the age of 8 weeks. Edgar had spent his retirement reading library books on the front porch in his rocking chair with Murphy at his feet. He had walked Murphy down the long county road every morning to bring up the mail. He had not, in 3 years of retirement, talked to Iris very much about the small affairs of his earlier life. She had thought, for 46 years of marriage, that there were no small affairs in his earlier life to talk about. She had been wrong. She had learned the wrongness the day she had opened Edgar's bank statements after the funeral and found a small monthly withdrawal of $300 she had not known about, going every month for 23 years to a savings account in a town 120 miles away that she had never heard of. She had not been able to make sense of the withdrawal. She had asked the bank manager. The bank manager had said the savings account was in Edgar's name only, and that the bank was not authorized to discuss its current balance with her. She had asked the attorney who had handled Edgar's will. The attorney had said the savings account had been listed in the will as a separate small bequest to a man named Theodore Pemberton in the same distant town, with a small handwritten note in the margin that read, "Theodore is my son from my first marriage, born 1955. See file H-119. The attorney had not been able to find file H-119. The attorney had said the file had been lost in the firm's transition between 2 senior partners. The attorney had said the savings account, whatever its balance, had been claimed by Theodore Pemberton within 30 days of the funeral, and the matter was closed. Iris had stood in the attorney's small front office in her thin black coat and not said a word. She had walked out. She had driven home. She had sat at the kitchen table with the small wooden urn on the mantel behind her and not moved for 2 hours. She had then made a small list, in her own careful long hand, of everything she had not known about her husband. The list had been short 3 items: the savings account, the son from a first marriage, and the file H-119. She had folded the list and put it in the inside pocket of her thin black coat. She had not asked anyone else about it. She had not gone to the distant town. She had not tried to find Theodore Pemberton. She had decided, that night at the kitchen table with Murphy across her feet, that whatever Edgar had been holding quietly for 23 years was not for her to take apart now. She had set the question down. She had let it stay set down for 9 years. Until this morning. She had brought Murphy in for his regular 6-month checkup at Dr. Halloran's office at 10 o'clock, the way she had brought him in twice a year for 11 years. Dr. Halloran was a small, careful man of perhaps 62 with thin, steel-rimmed glasses and a gentle voice, and the same gentle hands he had used on Murphy since the puppy's first vaccination 11 years ago. Murphy loved Dr. Halloran the way Murphy loved few people, and Murphy walked through the front door of the small one-story office on his own 4 feet every 6 months without being led, and Murphy walked back to the exam room on his own 4 feet behind Dr. Halloran without being called, and Murphy laid himself down on the cool metal exam table without being lifted. He did all of this again this morning. Dr. Halloran had run the small routine checks, the heart, the lungs, the joints, the small chip implant in Murphy's left shoulder. He had patted Murphy's black and white head and told Iris that the dog was healthy for his age and that he had a few more good years ahead of him. He had paused then, in a way Dr. Halloran did not usually pause. He had set both his thin hands flat on the metal exam table. He had looked at Iris across the table. He had said one quiet sentence. He had said that Edgar had left an envelope at his office 9 years ago, with instructions to deliver only when Murphy turned 11. He had said the day was today. He had said the envelope was in his small office safe. He had said he would bring it. He had walked out of the exam room and walked back in 2 minutes later with a manila envelope, sealed with a dull dark brown dab of old wax. He had slid it across the metal exam table to her. Iris had not picked it up at first. Murphy had pressed his nose to the corner of the envelope. Murphy had laid his black and white head down on it and closed his eyes. Iris had finally reached out and picked the envelope up. Murphy had not lifted his head. The envelope had been heavy. The flap had been sealed with the dull dark brown of old wax. She had turned the envelope over once. On the back in Edgar's careful small print were 4 words, "For my Iris only." She had stopped. Murphy had lifted his head and pressed his cold nose against the back of her wrist. Dr. Halloran had not spoken. Iris had sat very still on the stool beside the metal exam table for a long second after the 4 words. Dr. Halloran had not moved on the other side of the table. He had set both his thin hands on the metal beside the envelope and looked at her with his small, careful brown eyes through his thin, steel-rimmed glasses, and he had waited. He had said nothing. He had been waiting 9 years for the right Tuesday morning. He could wait another minute. Iris had finally lifted her face. She had asked him quietly when Edgar had brought the envelope to him. Dr. Halloran had told her the date. She had asked what Edgar had said the morning he had brought it. Dr. Halloran had told her that Edgar had not said very much. He had told her that Edgar had walked in with the envelope under his arm on a quiet morning in October, that he had set the envelope on the front waiting room desk, that he had asked Dr. Halloran to come out from the back, that he had handed the envelope across the desk with both hands, and that he had said the same sentence Dr. Halloran had said this morning. He had said, "Deliver only when Murphy turns 11." Dr. Halloran had said he had asked Edgar at the time why 11. Edgar had not answered. Edgar had simply said the date he wanted, written it on a small slip of paper, and laid the slip on top of the envelope. Edgar had thanked Dr. Halloran. Edgar had walked out. Dr. Halloran had put the envelope in his small office safe that afternoon. He had not opened it. He had not in 9 years opened the safe except to add other small private things and to take other small private things out. He had marked the date on the inside of his office calendar each year on the same day in January, and he had kept the date in the back of his mind, and the date had finally come this morning. He had not been able to bring himself to mention the envelope to Iris at any of the dozen routine visits in between. He had thought the envelope was Edgar's to deliver, and the morning was Edgar's to pick. He had carried the date with him for 9 years. He told Iris this quietly across the metal exam table. He told her he was glad to finally hand the envelope across. He told her he hoped whatever was inside was a kind thing. Iris held the envelope in her thin hand. She did not open it. She nodded once. She told Dr. Halloran that Edgar had been a careful, small, quiet man for 46 years, and that whatever was in the envelope would be a careful, kind thing, because Edgar had not been any other kind of man. She said it once and quietly. Dr. Halloran nodded. He came around the metal exam table and laid his thin hand gently on Murphy's black and white head one more time. Murphy thumped his tail against the metal. Dr. Halloran walked Iris and Murphy back through the front waiting room. He held the front door open. He watched her get into the small olive-green station wagon. He waved once. He went back inside. She had not opened the envelope in the exam room. She had set it gently into her handbag. She had thanked Dr. Halloran in a quiet voice she did not entirely recognize as her own. She had lifted Murphy down off the metal exam table and walked him through the front waiting room and out to the small olive-green station wagon Edgar had bought her in 1979. She had set Murphy on the passenger seat. She had walked around to the driver's side and gotten in. She had not started the engine for a long second. She had pulled the manila envelope out of her handbag and laid it on the steering wheel and looked at it. The 4 words on the back were in Edgar's careful small print. The dull dark brown wax was the kind of wax Edgar had used to seal small important things for 46 years. She had set the envelope back into her handbag. She had started the engine. She had driven home along the long county road in the late September morning light, with Murphy on the passenger seat with his black and white head out the half-open window. She had pulled into the gravel driveway of the small white house with the long front porch and the wood stove and the small framed photographs in the front room. She had carried the manila envelope and Murphy through the front door. She had set the envelope on the kitchen table. She had walked to the kitchen counter and made a pot of coffee. She had not opened the envelope yet. She had stood at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the back pasture and the cottonwood by the creek and the small cemetery up the road past the white church. She had stood at the counter for a long minute. Murphy had pressed his black and white shoulder against her ankle the whole time. She had finally turned and walked back to the kitchen table. She had sat down. She had pulled the envelope across the wood. She had taken a small letter opener from the drawer of the kitchen desk and slid it under the dull dark brown wax. The wax had cracked. She had lifted the flap. She had slid out what was inside. There were 3 things inside the envelope. The first was a small notarized document on heavy cream-colored paper with a county seal in the upper corner. The document was the title to a small lake cabin on a small private lake about 60 miles north, near the border with New York, in fee simple, free and clear, in the name of Iris L. Pemberton, with a notation in the lower corner that the cabin and its half-acre lot had been purchased in cash for $38,000 on a date 12 years ago, by Edgar Pemberton, with no other claim on the property. The second was a small green savings passbook from a bank in the small town near the cabin. The passbook was in the name Iris L. Pemberton, sole holder. The passbook had been opened 12 years ago with a deposit of $500 and had been added to in regular monthly deposits of $300 for the next 11 years, with one final deposit of $2,400 on the month before Edgar died. The current balance, printed in the small ledger column on the last page, was $41,020 and a small handful of cents. The third was a folded handwritten letter on Edgar's old cream-colored stationery. Iris read the document first. She read the passbook second. She read the letter last. She read it twice. The letter said, in Edgar's careful small printing, that he had bought the small lake cabin 12 years ago in her name only, and had been quietly saving into the small private savings account in her name only because he had begun to fear, around his 68th birthday, that his son Theodore from the first marriage might come back into his life at the wrong moment. Edgar's first marriage, which Edgar had carefully kept out of his conversations with Iris for 46 years, had ended in 1958 when Edgar's first wife had moved out west with their 3-year-old son and refused to allow Edgar any further visits. Edgar had paid child support for 15 years. Edgar had written letters every Christmas. The boy had not written back. Edgar had stopped sending letters at the boy's 18th birthday on his first wife's request. Edgar had not heard from the boy since the boy was 22, when the boy had written one short angry letter accusing Edgar of abandoning him and demanding the rest of Edgar's estate. Edgar had not answered that letter. Edgar had, however, set up the small monthly savings account at the same time, in Theodore's name, where Edgar had quietly placed $300 a month for the next 23 years. He had done this because he had not wanted his son to be poor when his son finally inherited him. He had also feared, around his 68th birthday, that the son might one day discover the existence of the small white house and the wood stove and the long porch in Pennsylvania, and decide to contest the will. So Edgar had quietly bought the small lake cabin in Iris's name only, and quietly opened the small private savings account in Iris's name only, and quietly arranged for Dr. Halloran to deliver this envelope when Murphy turned 11, because by Murphy's 11th birthday Edgar would either be dead or close to it, and the rest of his small estate would already have passed through probate, and the son would either have come and gone or would never come at all. He had asked Dr. Halloran to wait because he had not wanted Iris to learn about the small cabin and the small account on the day of the funeral. He had wanted the small cabin and the small account to come later, on a quiet morning at the vet's, when Iris had already learned how to live alone and was no longer in the worst of the grief. Edgar had judged the timing well. Murphy had pressed his head to the envelope at the vet's table, because Murphy had been at Edgar's elbow the day Edgar had walked the envelope across town to Dr. Halloran's office and explained the instructions, and Murphy had remembered the smell. Iris read the letter a third time. She set it down on the kitchen table. She did not cry. She had cried for 9 years and was not going to cry now. She lifted her face. She looked at Murphy at her feet. He was looking up at her with his quiet brown eyes. He thumped his tail once against the kitchen tile. She lifted her hand and laid it on his black and white head. She finally smiled slowly, the way a 78-year-old widow smiles when her husband of 46 years, dead 9 years, has just reached out across the kitchen table and laid his careful small hand on hers one last time. She did not move for a long time. She sat at the kitchen table with the title and the passbook and the letter spread out in front of her and her hand on Murphy's head, and the small pot of coffee gone cold on the counter. The sun moved through the kitchen window and across the table and across the title and across her thin wrist. She finally stood up. She walked to the bedroom and packed a small overnight bag with 2 changes of clothes, her thin black wool sweater, her hairbrush, her reading glasses, and the small framed photograph of Edgar at the kitchen table the morning of their 45th wedding anniversary. She walked back to the kitchen. She put the title and the passbook and the letter, and the small wooden urn from the mantel, into the inside pocket of her thin black coat. She lifted Murphy's leash from the hook by the back door. She put on her thin black coat. She walked Murphy out to the small olive green station wagon. She set the small overnight bag on the back seat. She lifted Murphy into the passenger seat. She walked around. She got in. She backed out of the gravel driveway. She drove north along the long county road. She drove for 2 hours. She crossed the state line. She turned off the highway at the small green sign that said the name of the small private lake from the title. She drove 4 miles along a small dirt road through a long stand of pines. She came to a small clearing at the lake's edge. In the clearing sat a small wooden cabin with a stone chimney and a small porch and a single front window, and a small wooden walkway down to a small dock at the lake. The lake was small and round, and very still in the late afternoon sun. She parked the station wagon. She turned off the engine. She did not get out for a long second. Murphy pressed his black and white shoulder against her arm. She finally opened the door. She got out. She walked up the small wooden walkway. She climbed the 3 porch steps. She stopped at the front door. She bent down. The welcome mat was a small woven brown mat that had been on the porch a long time, by the look of it. She lifted the welcome mat. Under the welcome mat was a small brass key, just where the letter had said it would be. She picked up the key. She opened the front door. The cabin smelled of cedar and pine sap, and a faint trace of the wood stove. The front room had a small couch, a small wooden table, a small bookshelf with a row of books in Edgar's old careful arrangement, and a small framed photograph on the wall above the wood stove of the front porch of the small white house in Pennsylvania, taken on the morning of their 45th wedding anniversary, with her standing in the doorway in her thin yellow dress. Ira stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long second. Murphy padded past her and walked through the front room into the small kitchen, and sniffed the cedar floor and lay down on a small braided rug under the kitchen window. He looked up at her with his quiet brown eyes. She finally walked all the way inside. She closed the front door behind her. She set the small overnight bag on the small couch. She walked to the kitchen. She filled a small enamel pitcher with water from the small kitchen sink. She poured the water into a small clay bowl on the kitchen floor beside Murphy. She walked back to the front room. She sat down on the small couch beside the overnight bag. She lifted her face. She looked at the framed photograph of the front porch of the small white house above the wood stove. She breathed in. She breathed out. She lifted the small framed photograph of Edgar at the kitchen table out of the overnight bag and set it on the small wooden table beside the couch, facing the wood stove. She lifted the small wooden urn out of the inside pocket of her thin black coat. She set it on the small wooden table beside the framed photograph. She set the title and the passbook and the letter on the small wooden table beside the urn. She looked at the small arrangement on the small wooden table for a long second. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. She finally stood up. She walked to the small front window. She looked out at the small round lake. The sun was low across the water. The cedar shadows were long. Murphy stood up from the braided rug in the kitchen and padded into the front room and pressed his black and white shoulder against her ankle. She set her thin hand on his head. She stood at the window for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried for 9 years. She did not need to cry anymore. She stayed at the cabin a week. She walked the small dock every morning with Murphy. She read 3 of the books on the small bookshelf, all of them mystery novels Edgar had loved, with his small, careful pencil notes in the margins in his careful small print. She cooked simple meals on the small 2-burner stove in the small kitchen. She slept in the small back bedroom on a small wooden bed Edgar must have built himself, judging from the small, careful joints at the corners. She talked to Murphy. She talked to the framed photograph of Edgar at the kitchen table. She talked once, sitting on the small porch in the late afternoon, to the small round lake in front of her, out loud, for the first time in 9 years, asking Edgar a question she had been holding in the back of her mind since she had read the letter at the kitchen table. The question was whether Theodore Pemberton, the son from the first marriage, had ever found out about her, about the small white house in Pennsylvania, about the small life Edgar had built quietly for 46 years. She asked it once. She did not expect an answer. She received no answer. Murphy pressed his black and white shoulder against her ankle the whole minute she was asking. The wind moved across the lake. The cedars stood quiet behind her. She finally let the question go. She had been a wife to quiet, careful, small man for 46 years, and the quiet, careful, small man had quietly arranged a small cabin and a small savings account and a small green passbook in her name only 12 years before he died. And the quiet, careful, small man had quietly arranged for an old sheepdog to lay his black and white head on a manila envelope on a vet's metal exam table on a September morning 9 years after his death. And that was the only answer she needed. She drove home at the end of the week. She did not sell the small house in Pennsylvania. She did not move to the cabin full-time. She kept both. She drove up to the small cabin for a week every May and a week every September for the next 11 years. She paid the small property taxes on the small cabin out of the small green passbook. The small green passbook still had $32,000 in it the day she finally died, in the small back bedroom of the small white house in Pennsylvania, with Murphy across her feet and the small framed photograph of Edgar on the dresser facing the bed. She had carried Murphy with her to the small cabin every May and every September of those 11 years, and Murphy had walked the small dock with her every morning, and Murphy had lain on the small braided rug under the small kitchen window every afternoon. And on the day she finally died, the small olive green station wagon was still parked in the gravel driveway of the small white house, and Dr. Halloran came up the long county road in his small black truck the next morning at the call from the neighbor who had found her, and Dr. Halloran lifted Murphy carefully off the small back bed and carried him out to his small black truck and drove him home to his own small house on the edge of the small town, where Murphy slept by the wood stove for the 4 more good years he had left, and where, on the morning Murphy finally died, Dr. Halloran sat down at his small kitchen table and wrote a short note to the law office across town, instructing the small wooden urn from the small white house to be carried up to the small cabin on the small round lake, and set on the small wooden table beside the framed photograph of Edgar, where the small careful arrangement could be finally, quietly, and at long last complete. Lake Cabin passed. In the small simple will Iris had written one quiet afternoon at the cabin's small wooden table 7 years before her death, to the small county land trust that managed the small private lake, with the single condition that the cabin be kept open 1 week each May and 1 week each September for any quiet widow or widower in the region who wished to come up and read on the porch and walk the small dock and remember a husband or a wife. The trust accepted the condition. The cabin was used every May and every September after that by some quiet widow or widower from somewhere across the region. Each guest signed a small leather guest book on the kitchen table. The guest book filled over 12 years. None of the guests ever met one another. None of them needed to. Each of them came up the small dirt road through the long stand of pines, climbed the 3 porch steps, lifted the small woven brown welcome mat, found the small brass key still there, opened the door, breathed in the smell of cedar and pine sap and the faint trace of the wood stove, and stayed quietly for a week. And in the small white house in Pennsylvania, the kitchen mantel above the wood stove stood empty of any small wooden urn from that morning forward, and the small framed photograph of Edgar at the kitchen table on the 45th wedding anniversary stayed in the front room with the door always slightly open, and the long county road outside the gravel driveway stayed quiet through every season, the way the long county roads of small Pennsylvania towns have always stayed quiet. And the morning sun came up across the back pasture, and the cottonwood by the creek, and the small cemetery up the road behind the white church the same way it had come up every morning for 53 of Iris Pemberton's 78 years, until at last it came up on a morning when no one was watching it from the kitchen window, and the small white house stood quietly empty in the long pale morning light, with the small olive green station wagon still in the gravel driveway, and the small careful life of a careful quiet man finally, completely, gently at rest.